This is Lecture 2, Functional Anatomy of the Nervous System, and we'll be covering sections 1 through 5 of Chapter 2. You don't need to read Section 6. Section 2.1, this is an overview of brain function and structure. One of the most basic and important aspects of brain function and structure is neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the nervous system to change both chemically and physically to adapt to the environment and compensate for injury. Neuroplasticity has a very broad meaning. Learning is dependent on neuroplasticity. Pretty much all of our basic cognitive and emotional functions are rooted in the ability of the nervous system to change in relation to the environment. The functional organization of the nervous system, I apologize for the figures. Usually they provide the figures in the book. This time I just had to take a picture. But I really like how they give you both the anatomical organization and the functional organization of the nervous system within your book. So the anatomical organization is the more traditional conceptualization of our nervous system. This is what I learned when I was in Intro to Psychobiology in undergrad. And in this, the nervous system is comprised of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And within the CNS, you have the brain and the spinal cord. And within the PNS, you have the somatic, autonomic, and enteric nervous system. The functional organization is more functional. It relates more to how the nervous system actually functions. And I think it's kind of a better and more updated version of the organization of the nervous system. So here you have the CNS and then all the parts of the peripheral nervous system kind of on the same level. And in the somatic nervous system, this breaks down into cranial and spinal nerves. Autonomic breaks down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And then the enteric is it doesn't have any subdivisions, at least at this point. So the central nervous system is what we usually think of as the human nervous system. This includes the brain and the spinal cord, and this mediates behavior. So this is responsible for most of our higher level behaviors. The somatic nervous system includes the spinal and cranial nerves. So this transmits sensory information from the body to the central nervous system. This comes from muscles, joints, and skin. So this is like the what we think of as like our sensory organs and sensory systems. And the CNS transmits motor instructions to the somatic nervous system to control movement. The autonomic nervous system regulates the functions of the internal organs and the glands. So if you've heard of the fight or flight response, this happens through the sympathetic nerves. This is like an arousal system. And then conversely, the rest and digest response is the opposite of fight or flight. And this is through the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is like a calming response. So these two, parasympathetic and sympathetic, kind of act together to balance out arousal and then more calming mechanisms. And then the enteric nervous system controls the gut. So this, if you hear about like gut bacteria and how this relates to behavior, this is kind of a hot topic in science, and you see it reported in the media. When the media reports on science, you hear this once in a while. The enteric nervous system is kind of a mesh of neurons that are in the lining of the gut, so in the stomach and the digestive system, that runs from the esophagus to the colon. And this is mostly responsible for digesting food into nutrients, of course, but it actually has a lot of interplay with the central nervous system, and we will go over that in more detail in a bit. Okay, finding your way around the brain. So this is just directions in the brain. So these are important to know because you'll hear terms like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and you want to know what that means. You want to know what dorsal means and what lateral is, where you might find that area of the brain. So anterior, posterior, and rostral-caudal mean essentially the same thing. Anterior means the front, posterior means the back, same with rostral-caudal. And then dorsal and ventral mean pretty much the same as superior, inferior. Dorsal means on the back. So if you think of like a dolphin has its dorsal fin on the back of its body, that's dorsal means back, and ventral means like the belly or the bottom. And then medial lateral. Medial is the middle, going toward the middle of the brain, and lateral means toward the outside of the brain. Especially in neuroimaging, we also talk about 3 different planes of the brain, 3 different ways you can kind of slice the brain for images in fMRI, for example. There's the coronal plane, which essentially goes dorsal to ventral. The horizontal plane goes from anterior to posterior, and the sagittal plane cuts the hemispheres, the right and the left hemispheres, from each other. So we have a few structures that protect the brain from damage. These include the meninges. This is 3 layers of tissue. It's the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and pia mater. And then we have cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, which is a clear solution, mostly comprised of sodium chloride and other salts. The ventricles, which are holes, holes that don't have gray matter or white matter in the brain, in the forebrain. These are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and CSF also circulates around in the brain and the spinal cord beneath that arachnoid layer to cushion the brain, and also provides some kind of cleaning and healing functions for those areas of the brain. Most of you might remember from Psych 100, or if you took AP Psychology in high school, there are 4 main lobes of the brain. These lobes are present on both the right and the left side. The temporal lobe is this orange one in the figure. It's responsible for hearing, language, music, memory functions as well. So there's an interior part or a medial part of the temporal lobe that plays a large part in memory. The frontal lobe is the one in the front. It's the largest lobe, and this one's responsible for executive functions, which are higher level cognitive functions like decision making. And then the parietal lobe, which is this green one, up kind of on the top of your head, and this is responsible for spatial orientation, integrating sensory information, and a number of other functions as well. And then the occipital lobe is actually responsible pretty much exclusively for vision. So vision is a very prominent sensory process in humans and in most animals. And so we have a lobe of the brain responsible just for vision. The cerebral cortex, which we also call the neocortex, is this outer part of the brain. It's thin, it's folded into gyri and sulci, and it's comprised of the bodies of neurons. If you look at these pictures on the right, it's the darker part on the top of the brain, on the outer part of the brain. We also call it gray matter. And the neocortex is responsible for higher order nervous system tasks. So the thickness of the neocortex often corresponds to how good the brain is at these functions, even looking between individuals. So in anatomical MRI research, when we image the brain, just the brain structures, sometimes, for example, IQ might be correlated with the thickness of the neocortex in an individual in certain areas of the brain. There's also white matter, which is literally this lighter kind of white looking or maybe light gray looking substance in the more middle part of the brain or underneath the neocortex. And this contains mostly the neuronal axons. Ventricles, as I mentioned just earlier, are these cavities or holes in the brain. They contain CSF. They help cushion the brain. They maintain metabolism, just kind of help with kind of the upkeep and health of the rest of the brain. The corpus callosum are bands of white matter that connect the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. And it's kind of a striking structure that's just has all these white matter tracks running through it. It allows communication between the hemispheres and contains approximately 200 million nerve fibers. So white matter is responsible for communication between neurons. White matter, as we talk about individual neurons later, it's the axon or the kind of connecting strands of the neurons. So this part of the brain, white matter, is responsible for helping brain areas communicate with each other, and is actually more and more we're coming to learn that white matter is actually very important for the integrity of a lot of cognitive and sensory functions. Before, gray matter was kind of what most scientists focused on. Like I mentioned before, the thickness of the gray matter and whether gray matter is activated in certain tasks. But kind of maybe in the past 10 to 15 years, we've realized that white matter is extremely important as well. Severing the corpus callosum, or cutting it surgically, can cause an interesting disorder called split brain syndrome. It's rare that this is done, and it's usually a last resort when someone with epilepsy has not responded to other treatments. But effectively, when the corpus callosum is cut, this is the only connection point between the two hemispheres, so it creates two brains, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, no longer communicate on intentions, thoughts, perceptions. So information is coming into the brain separately, and ideas and cognitions that are being formed in the separate hemispheres are also not being transferred to the other hemisphere. And the behavioral correlates of this are that a patient can kind of have different intentions, or sort of has two different personalities almost on the different sides of the body. So a patient might button her shirt with one hand and unbutton the shirt with the other hand. One side of the brain wants to wear the shirt, the other side doesn't. If a patient has their eyes closed and they're handed an object in their left hand, and therefore have no visual input in the right field, they're not able to say out loud what this object was. And this is because certain functions such as language are lateralized, which means they're predominantly processed on one side of the brain. And so the language side of the brain is on the right side. And if someone is handed an object on the left side, the percepts that from the left side of the brain can't get to the language side of the brain. If you're interested, there are some videos of split brain patients here, and there's actually quite a bit more on the internet in general. So if you're particularly interested in split brain patients, let me know and I can give you more information. The brain is made up of cells and fibers. So nuclei are groups of cells that are clustered together, cells being neurons in the brain for the most part. Nuclei are groups of cells that are clustered together and they form like a functional group. Nerves are large collections of axons, which we'll get to, but axons are branches that come out from the cell body that communicate information to other cells. And so a nerve is a large collection of this that run together outside of the central nervous system. And then a tract is the same thing, but it's inside the nervous system. Neurons are obviously vitally important to the major functions of the brain. Glial cells, on the other hand, are kind of, we consider them to be like supportive cells. They're sort of cells that surround neurons, kind of create structure and framework for the brain. And we used to think of them just as purely supportive cells, but we're also finding out that they do quite a bit of modulating neuronal activity, so they can actually be rather important in the function of a neuron. And if you look at this picture down on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side at the bottom, the glial cells are the big red ones, and you can see they kind of, this particular type of glial cell creates sort of a structure that the neurons can kind of weave in between, so they create a bit of a framework for the neurons to grow upon.